Good afternoon. We're back. Last session of the day, and at least for BCIA, one of the most important ones we've had in a long, long time. As you know about the discussions of reserve practice earlier today and actually over the last couple of years with the looming September 1st deadline, before we can actually finalize and obtain consensus from the other regulators on our definition of reserve practice, we had to significantly look at our areas of practice first. As you may, well, you should all know from paying your dues that you have to check what area of practice you work in, and you probably notice there's 38 of them, many of which were not, to be polite, were not clearly defined, which made it very, very difficult in reserve practice because it's difficult to enforce something if I can't even explain what exactly it is to a layperson or a judge. So we were in desperate need of help, and fortunately, there was a champion that we were able to find. Mr. Keith Duhaime has been a member of BCIA for a significant period of time. He is a former president. He's got a PhD in engineering from UBCO. He's got a master's degree in agribusiness. He's currently, and I try to talk him out of it, but he moved to Winnipeg to take a long-term contract. And if anybody's watched the weather in Winnipeg in the last couple of weeks, I warned him. I said, "What the heck are you doing?" Because I used to live in Winnipeg for a while, but nope, nobody listens. So, but thankfully, prior to him moving there, he did work on our definition of regulated practice that many of you would have seen the report about probably 16, 18 months ago now. But we were fortunate we were able to convince him to continue to take our money and move on to the reserve practice concept. And that's where the areas of practice come in. So what you're going to see is his final report to council. That explanation is significant because it is not the final position of BCIA on this. We are presenting this both here in the room and online today. Looking for questions and comments over the next, sooner than later. We will then finalize the areas of practice, and only then will council vote on it. Once that is done, well, it will be simultaneous. While that process is ongoing, we'll be working on our descriptive materials that Paul talked about this morning, all heading toward, about the September 1st deadline. The actual deadline for the descriptive materials, I think, is the first week of August, but prior to that, we actually have to go out and do presentations with respect to our descriptive materials to external stakeholders. So the summer is going to be pretty busy for us, but without Keith's wonderful work, we wouldn't even be this far. So with no, are you coming up or are you just walking around? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Keith Duhaime.
Thank you, JP. Let's see, this was worked properly. Just a little bit of a background on this project. So it's a bit of a challenge. As JP alluded to, Carl? Is that possible? Okay. Hello? On? Hello? Okay. So as JP alluded to, I've been a member actually about 22 years, 23 years with the BC Institute. And there's a bit of a history to this project in that back about better part 20 years ago, the then president asked me to go over to the then ED's office in Abbotsford and pick up the database of all the membership in their practice areas at the time. And Garth Bean was the ED then, and he passed on this database that had I don't know, 1,500 odd members in it, and their list of practice areas in a column. And if you ran a unique sort on that, you ended up with about 900 different practice areas. So that's where we started at almost 20 years ago. And I've had a number of discussions. Brian Maws, I don't think is here today, but he and I have had several discussions over the years about how to rationalize that. And I think Don Rugg was the one that actually brought it down to about 38 or so. 38. But before we got to 38, this was the diagram that Garth used to go around to meetings with and show where we were at. And as you can see, it's you got practice of agrology in the center, but you've got all this web of stuff which really doesn't have any order or rhyme to it in some ways. And that's what Don, I think, took down the 38 at one point. As JP alluded to, everything I'm talking about today is kind of nested within the fact that we have a new regulated practice definition for agrology. And then within that, we've got a reserve practice definition. And so whatever you're seeing today, you maybe think, oh, that's maybe a forester's work or a biologist's work, whatever. No, you have to think about everything is nested in context to those definitions. This is what the OSPG has finally settled on for us. And now the challenge is to review those areas of practice and rationalize them even further to something manageable. And it's not just necessary from the perspective of what we provide OSPG with, but also in terms of sustainability, because as JP alluded to, part of what we're going to have to do is look at practice standards. And that means striking standards committees and stuff. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of hard pressed to think that we could have 38 different standards committees. We really have to be very focused on what we do within each, and I don't think that would be very sustainable for the Institute. So what is the practice of agrology? Advice or services that are based on agricultural and natural resource sciences or agricultural or resource economics and relate to, first, the cultivation, production, improvement, processing, marketing, or management of aquatic or terrestrial plants or animals. 2, the classification, management, use, conservation, protection, or enhancement of aquatic, terrestrial, atmospheric ecosystems that are affected by, sustain, or have the potential to sustain the cultivation, production of aquatic or terrestrial plants or animals. Or 3, the restoration, reclamation, or remediation of aquatic, terrestrial, and atmospheric ecosystems. And that last one really speaks to where a lot of our membership is at now, which is in environmental services, right? Reserve practice, to nest it a little further, narrow things down, relates to providing advice or another service that, having regard to the protective purposes, requires the experience or technical knowledge of an agrologist. And the thing that you really have to pay attention to here is this protective purpose, which is defined as includes the safety, health, and welfare of the public, including the protection of the environment and the promotion of health and safety in the workplace. I usually think of this as what I call the 4 Ps. In other words, is what you're doing potentially going to hurt a person, either health or injury-wise? Is it going to damage their property? Is it going to damage the value of their property, the purse? Or is it going to damage the public interest in some way, shape, or form, which could mean something that we acknowledge as being of value to the general public, like animal welfare or preserving agricultural land or something like that. So that's where I take that, or that's what I take it to mean in practical terms. And in that context, what defines a practice area is that we as agrologists, or at least some of us within a particular practice area, have very specialized knowledge to help mitigate that damage to the public interest. as I think most of you know in this room, Bonnie Kaler, who's also worked with me on this project, she created an online survey to get some good feedback on what our membership was doing in terms of their perspectives on their practices and what they felt were the real knowledge needs. And we had about, we had 360 or 370 unique responses, somewhere in that neighborhood, which turned into about 204 pages of comments that we had to go through, which made it a bit of a challenge. And maybe that was a good thing because, as I alluded to earlier, I'd been struggling, and a couple of us have been struggling with this for a long time. And it made me really sort of sit back and look at this from a higher level again. What are we doing? Because we had these 38 areas of practice, and we had them across about 5 different sectors. But maybe we should redefine at the very top of what those sectors are. So, and that's what we did. Traditionally, we had agricultural and environmental, which I think creates some confusion. Life sciences, food. Then we had the stuff that we defined as being common to all 4 sectors. And then we had an other, which happened to be aquaculture on the list. So I sat back and looked through all the stuff that had been provided. So, okay, let's look at this high level. I'm going to leave economics aside for a second. But what do we do as agrologists? First of all, there's a group of us that are involved in growing things or producing things. And that involves your traditional agricultural based practice areas. So people who are doing the crop production, horticulture, livestock, whatever, right? Range, helping grow cattle on a range, managing the forages on a range. Is there another one? Helping with the forest sector, silviculture practices. Then we have some of us that are involved in processing the products in some manner. Food processing, as an example. Or in processing the waste of these primary production processes or the waste from food processing. So that became my processing sector. Then we have a group within our membership that are involved in what I would call macro scale use of resources, particularly land and water resources, classifying land or deciding on what uses land should be put to or what uses they shouldn't be put to because of incompatibilities. And then finally, and this is probably the biggest single area of our membership now, is that's environmental resources, protecting environmental resources. This is where your reclamation, remediation, your looking at contaminants on a site, trying to reclaim that site or contain those contaminants, all the stuff that's involved in the environmental sector. And then finally, just going back to economics, we have a group of people within our membership who, if you think about all these things, they're all about resources and processes that are subject to natural risk of some sort. So they're subject to weather, pests. The products are just variability in getting inputs. If you're in agriculture, what's available of fertilizers and chemicals, or they're also looking at the other side in terms of what's happening to the products of those production systems. And they're all, unlike the chairs you're sitting in, they're all subject to decay over time, pretty much, right? Through biologic processes. I produce a chair, today it's worth $50, tomorrow it's worth $50. I produce a pound of strawberries, today it's worth $5, tomorrow maybe $3.50, day after that it might be, you know, just because of natural decay processes. Same thing with milk or almost any other agricultural product. So we have a group of people that engage certain skills and knowledge to support agrology in that manner. So let's start with the economic sector. And one thing you're going to find is that the actual definitions that I proposed for these practice sectors are very short. I've gone through a bit of a learning process with JP and his fellow LLB graduates and how they think and how policy makers think. Shorter is often sweeter, and it's often to our advantage, and we just don't realize it. So I've defined a practice area of agricultural and natural resource economics, the practice of providing providing services and advice using scientific and economic principles, knowledge, and expertise to inform the efficient and sustainable use of limited agricultural and natural resources for optimal benefit. And by the way, these are all drafts from the perspective of the Institute. They're my report, but I know Daryl here, for example, is a ag economist, so he's free to write in and give us his feedback on that. If and likewise with any other agricultural economists. And as I sort of alluded to, agrologists in this practice area may have previously declared, and we sort of summarized the practice areas that previously people doing this kind of work may have fallen under. So agricultural economics and trade, rural community development and support, natural resource and forest management, business management, investment, financing, marketing, and supply chains. Just a note that number 14 here, natural resource and forest management, might also fall under, some of the people there might also fall under another practice area that we'll be talking about. What do the agrologists in this area do? They inform governments, companies, and private individuals to better optimize production and use of agricultural and natural resources. They assess, prepare, and analyze budgets for agricultural and natural resource enterprises. They conduct feasibility studies for new enterprises. They assess the economic damage of pests and or invasive species. They advise agriculture and or natural resource enterprises on insurance strategies. They assess the value of agricultural and natural resource enterprises. And finally, they might be involved in advising an agricultural and natural resource policy and regulation. Now, one of the things we want to keep in mind is I've listed a number of different activities here. It may not be comprehensive. This is not what we want to be putting before the OSPG. We do not want to create a situation where we've listed a bunch of activities as being part of that reserve practice. And then somebody comes along and says, well, I don't have to obey the rules and be a member of the BCIA because I do item number 11, which is not on your list of 10, right? What are some of the knowledge areas? And I've tried to list a few things here, and as you're going through these slides, keep in mind that I'm thinking at least third or fourth year university level. For economists, I've put down agricultural and natural resource production systems because that's part of what differentiates them from other economists, is that they have some idea of what goes on with the production systems that they're analyzing. Research and statistical methods, econometrics, finance theory, trade policy, climate change trends might be another one. That might be one actually that we'll talk a little later. That's actually an area that maybe should be part of every practice area.
You want questions at the end?
I think it'd probably be better if we wait to the end. Yeah. Just because maybe some of those questions might get answered on the way through. Knowledge and expertise varies depending on main practice activities and whether focus is resource economics or agricultural economics. In other words, and this comes back to your basic ethics, and Paul Craven kind of referenced that this morning when he was talking about tax law. He's not a tax lawyer. Each and every one of us has to be cognizant of what our particular area of expertise is and stay within that lane. Growing and production sector. So I've defined several different practice areas under that. The first one being crop development, production, and management, which is defined as using scientific principles to inform the efficient and sustainable use of limited resources in the production and consumption of plants or fungi for human use. So it's not just about food, it's also about fiber, fuel, all the other things that we grow plants for. In this previously, some of our members may have self-identified as being under crop development, production, and management, some under horticulture, apiculture, fruit, vegetables, and turf development. Irrigation, planning, and development would also be in there. And finally, soil fertility evaluation and nutrient management. They're all about growing crops in some way, shape, or form, right? We define crops here as plants or fungi grown and harvested on an annual or periodic basis for human use. And the crops can be categorized into 6 categories: terrestrial and aquatic food crops for human consumption, feed crops for livestock production, fiber crops for cordage and textiles, oil crops for consumption or land uses, or natural industrial uses, excuse me, ornamental crops for landscape gardening, and industrial and secondary crops for various personal and industrial uses, including pharmaceuticals and fuel production. Agrologists in this practice area might be involved in developing nutrient management plans, advising on weed management, developing new crop varieties that are suited to specific agronomic conditions and devoid of undesirable characteristics. For example, non-toxic to human health. They might advise on crop varieties suited to specific growing conditions or identify and treat crop diseases. They might develop and advise on crop harvest strategies and methods for optimal benefit to society. And finally, they might also develop and advise on crop grading and post-harvest handling, storage, and distribution systems to some degree. They might have, or they should have, some expertise probably in crop production systems, crop nutrition and management, soil chemistry, fertility, microbiology and processes, soil physics and hydrology, field research methods and statistics, crop and plant ecology, weed, pest, and disease identification and management, and finally, on regulatory policy. Carrying on to our next PA. We've talked about crops. Let's talk about livestock for a second. Livestock development, production, and management, which involves using scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to inform the efficient and sustainable use of limited resources into production and consumption of animal and animal products for human use. Previously, our members may have self-identified as being under number 8, under the old list of livestock development, production, and management, or under aquaculture, which is really just another form of agriculture, right? And they may also include bees as well. Livestock can be identified, with exception, as privately owned animals that are bred, kept, nourished, grown, and harvested directly or indirectly for human use. Livestock are predominantly produced for food, fiber, fur, hides, recreational, and medicinal uses, or medical uses. Agrologists in this practice area have knowledge and expertise in livestock production systems, including housing, handling practices and standards, animal nutrition, disease and welfare management, animal behavior, statistical and research methods to inform livestock development and production, and livestock production, ecology, and environmental impacts. Both of the previous production areas are also kind of distinct in that they're predominantly in privately owned property, right? Now we move on to rangeland and grazing management. And one of the first distinctions here is that this is often publicly owned land in some way, shape, or form. Not always, but for a good chunk of it, right? And we define this area as using principles, scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to inform the efficient and sustainable use of rangeland resources in the production and consumption of plants and animals on rangeland while respecting the public interest. And previously, our membership may have put themselves under either rangeland evaluation, conservation, planning, and management, or under vegetation identification, assessment, and management. Though that second one could appear in other places as well. Rangelands can be used to graze livestock, such as cattle and sheep. They can be harvested for timber and fiber, provide recreational opportunities, serve as wildlife habitat, sequester carbon in their soils, and purify water for community drinking systems. We expect, or we'd hope that, I think that agrologists in this practice area would have knowledge in grazing systems, pasture and forage management, animal nutrition, disease, behavior, and welfare management, invasive species identification and management, rangeland ecology, hydrology and watershed management, for statistical and research methods to inform range management, and finally, natural resource and environmental economics. It should be noted here also that I haven't talked up to now, but as agrologists, we got to be also cognizant of the limitations to our practices, right? We're on public lands now. Besides all the things that we do out there, there's also wildlife, for example. And that really falls under the biologists to manage, and natural ecosystems. We really have to think about what our lane is and stay within it. Same thing with the forest resources on the landscape. There's certain things, yes, we can provide some guidance and advisement on, but if the foresters out there, they've got their reserve practice definitions too, and their areas that they're going to practice in. And then we talk about agroforestry and forestry and silviculture. And again, remember that even though I use the word forestry here, it's within the context of our reserve practice and our regulated practice definitions. It does not mean we are foresters. So we have to be cognizant of that and mindful of that. And we define this as being the use of scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to inform the efficient and sustainable use of forestry resources while respecting the public interest. And that harkens back to what I just said about remembering the other professions as well. Previously, we had members that were registered under agroforestry, and this is where they would be slotted this time. Agroforestry represents an opportunity to further enhance the potential benefits through the integration of crop and livestock operations and other enterprises into forests. Agrologists in this practice have knowledge and expertise in classifying soils and their properties, podology, to inform foresters in their work, managing and advising on soil nutrition for silviculture operations, identifying and managing invasive weeds and plants, and statistical and research methods to inform operations. And I'd certainly welcome if there's other things that, not just with this practice area, but with any of the practice areas here where the actual practitioners among our membership are operating in terms of expanding these activities, if it's justifiable. Processing sector. So we've done some growing things and producing things. Now what are we going to do with them? We're going to process them somehow. And that could either be in themselves as feedstocks, or it could be that they're byproducts or waste from another process. The practice of providing services and advice using scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to inform the efficient and sustainable use of limited resources in the production of safe, quality food products for human and animal consumption. So that's our food development, production, and processing practice area within the processing sector. Previously, we might have had agrologists listed as their practice area being health and nutrition products, nutraceuticals, food, beverage, and feed development and processing, food safety and biosecurity, and functional foods. Foods can consist of plant, animal, insect, and fungi products consumed directly or with minimal processing, or that can be the result of complex processing, production, and distribution systems. We expect that within this practice area, agrologists have knowledge in crop and livestock production systems that provide the primary inputs to food development, processing, production, and distribution, some food science, food microbiology, food safety systems such as HACCP, hazard analysis and critical control points, and statistical and research methods to inform quality control in the food processing and production sectors, and then finally food regulation and policy. So that was the food side of it. Now we're talking about the sort of the bioprocessing side, or processing for other things, using scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to inform the efficient, sustainable storage and processing of biological waste and feedstocks for human uses respectful of the public interest. And previously, we would have had agrologists register either under waste, compost, and manure management, or maybe under renewables development, biofuels, biofiber, or bioenergy. It's kind of interesting when you read through the results of the survey, and you'd see the same activities be identified under both these two categories. I think composting came up under both categories, anaerobic digesters, etc. So we've really been kind of redundant over the last couple of decades with those two practice areas in many ways, at least from where our membership was working. We expect that agrologists are going to be able to provide some expertise in process control management, monitoring high quality and quality assurance of both inputs and the resulting products, and in selecting sites used for waste and byproduct storage and handling facilities. Agrologists in this practice area have knowledge and expertise in agricultural waste management, waste treatment processing, industrial microbiology, environmental chemistry and biology, environmental risk management, and of course, then they're going to need some statistical process control probably for it. And then finally, regulations and policies with respect to agricultural food processing, biosolids, and other similar waste. Just to speak to that a little bit, right now I'm involved in getting environmental licenses and stuff in place for a couple new abattoirs on the prairies, and it's come up that we need some composting facilities for paunch manure, and there's very specific rules, and in reviewing those licensing requirements, the agrologists are recognized for the processing part, but when it comes to the actual facilities themselves, the pads and stuff, that's an engineering. That's very specifically engineering expertise that's required. So again, it comes back to that idea of we're not alone out there, and we need to respect the other professions in our work. Land and water resources sector. So this is, as I stated at the beginning, this is where we're looking at the macro level of managing our land resources and water resources for the public benefit. And it includes the use of scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to inform the evaluation, classification, conservation, and management of land resources in respect of the public interest. Agrologists in this practice area may have previously declared their practice areas being either number 3, arable land evaluation, conservation, planning, and management. Number 11, ecological land classification and mapping. Number 16, soil and terrain classification, mapping, and land evaluation. Number 22, land negotiations, leasing, and dispositions. Or finally, number 27, wetland and riparian area evaluation, conservation planning and management. Land resources serve many purposes: agriculture, range, forestry, wetlands, recreational, commercial, industrial, and residential uses. Agrologists in this practice area, we would expect to have some knowledge of soil classification, pedology, some geomorphology maybe, some landscape ecology, terrestrial ecosystem mapping, depending on what they're doing, some geomatics, geographic information systems. If they're involved in the actual planning part of it, probably should have some landscape ecology, some hydrology and hydrogeology as well, maybe some watershed management, land use planning. Certainly indigenous perspectives should be part of their knowledge base. And then some expertise in public engagement and outreach. Because often there's some social, economic, or social political perspectives that have to be accounted for. Very closely associated with land is water, often. As they say here in the Okanagan, we don't have great farmland, but all you have to do is just add water. Using scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to inform the planning and management of water resources in respect to the public interest. And previously, our membership would have probably self-identified as being under water resource planning and management. And depending on how water might be chemically or biologically contaminated, its use might result in situations that place human, livestock, and wildlife health at risk, or it might adversely affect crops and vegetation. So agrologists might help inform and plan and assess and manage these water resources by using knowledge in soil science and physics, landscape ecology, crop science and production systems, hydrology and hydrogeology, watershed management, water and environmental chemistry, and finally, they probably need some knowledge in land use planning as well. The final sector we're going to talk about, and that it probably encompasses, or I think it does encompass the biggest portion of our membership now, is the environmental sector. And the first thing we're going to talk about there is protection and management of environmental resources. The practice of providing services and advice using scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to protect and sustain and sustainably manage environmental resources in respect of the public interest. And when I talk about environmental resources here, I'm talking about air, soil, water, air, and vapor, basically, and biological resources. Agrologists' practice area may have previously declared their practice area as contaminated land assessment, remediation, and decommissioning, environmental impact assessment and mitigation planning, environmental management systems and audit, air quality monitoring and management, greenhouse gas verification and management. May have all been in there in some way, shape, or form. Contaminants and adverse impacts on environmental resources can be physical, chemical, or biological, resulting from either human activity or natural phenomena. The practice area can be classified by 5 major activities of work: assessing the state of environmental resources, providing advice to prevent and protect environmental resources, the remediation of contaminated or adversely impacted environmental resources, monitoring the state of environmental resources, or conducting audits, ensuring compliance, and certifying processes and facilities that might impact environmental resources. Agrologists' practice area, we would expect to have expertise and knowledge in soil, water, environmental chemistry, soil microbiology and processes, soil sampling and analysis techniques, spatial statistics to interpret the resulting data, soil physics, hydrology and hydrogeology, environmental ecology, statistical and research methods, geomatics, GIS, spatial stats, environmental risk assessment, and environmental regulation and policies. And then we have to look at land reclamation and restoration itself. Practice of providing services and advice using scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to reclaim and restore land resources in respect of the public interest. And we used to have previously or currently we have a practice area called soil and land conservation, reclamation, planning, and management that our members would probably directly move under under this new practice area. Land reclamation involves developing and implementing a plan that considers and integrates logistical management and biophysical considerations to recover land for a specific use. Land restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. We can expect that agrologists in this area would provide expertise in soil, water, and environmental chemistry, soil microbiology and processes, soil sampling techniques, and the analysis of the results, soil physics, hydrology and hydrogeology, environmental ecology to a certain extent, statistical research methods, geomatics, and GIS and spatial stats, among other areas of knowledge and expertise. Excuse me. And finally, I think this is the last one. Within that is what about the climate itself? And, or actually, this is the second last one. There is one more. Climate change impacts assessment, mitigation, adaptation. So using scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to assess climate changes, impacts, mitigation, and adaptation strategies in respect of the public interest. And previously, we did have people under greenhouse gas verification and management, but we didn't really have any other PAs that would come close to matching this one. To address the challenge of climate change and avoid the worst of these impacts on natural ecosystems, agriculture, and public infrastructure, agrologists possess distinct knowledge and expertise within their specific practice areas to assess climate change and trends. Now, this is an interesting one, and I've had a few conversations here already. Personally, I only know of one agrologist, and I think somebody did mention a name of another agrologist who actually does that kind of work. The one I know is Dr. David Spittlehouse. He's the only one I know that has the background in climatology and meteorology and weather modeling and stuff to be able to do that particular activity. Where I think most of us end up is either we're taking the results of his work or similar, and we're assessing climate change impacts on whatever our area of expertise is, or we're employing or we're helping advise on mitigation strategies, or we're helping in terms of formulating an adaptation plan. I think it was JP asked me yesterday how many we were down to, or at one point I said 13, but I said, maybe this is one that could actually go away in some respects. Because if you think about it, most of those activities are something the rest of us should be doing anyway. Just part of our obligation for due care. And the final one is invasive species management. And they're biological contaminant, right? And what we do is we provide services and advice using scientific principles, knowledge, and expertise to manage invasive species in respect of the public interest. Previously, we did have a practice area called pest management and biocontrol. Now, some of the people under that may put themselves under this area of practice. They also may cross-identify as being under crop production because of weed management, right? Invasive species management involves looking at unconstrained production, propagation, and/or reproduction of any living organism that can result in that organism becoming a threat to food production and agriculture, the function of natural ecosystems, human health and safety, and potentially damaging to private property and public infrastructure. Agrologists practice area, we expect to have some knowledge in environmental sciences and chemistry, ecology and environment evolutionary biology, plant and animal sciences, weed science, entomology, pest identification and management, crop protection products and methods, and potentially wildlife control. So that's our proposed areas of practice as they stand right now. We also, in reviewing the 38 practice areas, recognized that some of them really didn't belong on the list. And there were several reasons for that. First of all, did they meet that fundamental definition of what constitutes a practice area? And that is, can you identify a threat to the public good and where only a specialized knowledge of an agrologist can address or mitigate that threat? Some may be subject to another regulatory body. I think we have members here from the engineering, from EGBC, from CAB, College of Applied Biology. Do we have any, we got ASTTB in the room. Do we have any foresters present? Anybody cross-license of forest? Good. So yeah, we have to respect those professions and their reserve practice. And then finally, maybe the practice area doesn't even fall under the jurisdiction of the PGA at all. Number 6, the first one actually, international development. People like JP are probably much better at answering that question. My understanding is that me being a PAG in BC ends at the British Columbia border. So what happens when I go beyond the British Columbia border? If I'm involved in a project overseas. Secondly, if I'm working on an overseas project in some kind of international development capacity, why am I really there? It's probably not because of I'm saying I'm an international development person. It's probably because I'm there as a crop production person or a livestock production person or in some kind of agroforestry project or something, right? So it's really not, at least in my mind, as I produce this report, a practice area within itself, on top of the fact that it's there's some questions about the jurisdiction. Bioengineering and design, there's only about 9 people in all of our membership that identified it last year as being in that area. I would be one of those. I am licensed as a professional engineer as well. And I know several of those other people also licensed as professional engineers. And in working in an engineering firm, I know there's times I would use my engineering stamp, or other times I use my agrologist stamp. And I'm really not seeing a case for that to continue within the BCIA, just because the types of activities often you're carrying out are really engineering activities that require that stamp. Education, teaching, and extension. Again, are those activities within, is that a practice area in itself? Or do you really mean you're a crop production specialist teaching somebody how to do crop production or doing some extension work or something? So I don't consider that, at least in my context, I don't consider that, in my opinion, to be a true practice area. It's really an activity that you carry out within another practice area. Human resource and operations management. Again, I would consider that like education, teaching, and extension, something that you're really doing as an activity within the context of another area. Regulatory support consultation. This is going to be an interesting one going back to some of the discussion with Paul Craven this morning. If we've got agrologists in government involved with regulatory support and consultation, and they're dealing with issues around livestock, should they not be first a person who has, as a practice area, livestock production? I'm not going to answer that question, but again, I see that more as an activity, not as a PA in itself. And then finally, research, technology development, transfer, and application. Again, I see that those are all activities under other PAs. So to summarize, the proposed practice sectors and practice areas should not be viewed as complete. I think I've already asked you if you want to email me or whoever JP designates to provide some further input. That would be appreciated. Each sector and practice area will continue to evolve. And Paul kind of alluded to that as well this morning, that the whole PGA and OSPG and all the processes around this as we move to reserve practices are going to continue to evolve and grow. However it does, though, BCIA will have an obligation to the public to ensure that its definitions and standards evolve to protect the public interest. And I think really the next steps out of this will be for the BCIA to look at commissioning a standards committee for each of these practice areas under the reserve practices of agrology to continue to refine and fine tune what we've set forward here. If you want a copy of my report, here's the link you can download it from. And otherwise, I'll open the floor to questions. Okay.
Retraction of the education. Previous, oh, in fact, why don't you use that mic and I'll use this and I'll take it around to questions. Okay. My question is with respect to the retraction of the educational aspect, and it's not necessarily direct to it, but what is your opinion, because we're starting to run into this on the licensing of faculty, of university faculty, and should they be, like, when you think about it, how can, if they're teaching the next generation of agrologists, how can they do then if they're not a professional agrologist? Now, my understanding is fact that there's two schools of thought within faculty, that it's none of our business to interfere in their academic freedom, yada, yada, yada. But what is your thought on that, being that you are one?
I think I'd have to turn it over to, I put the question out here to, is there anybody here representing the engineers? Because I think when I was doing my PhD and stuff, all of our faculty were required to be members, right? And
yeah, for the engineering and geoscience profession, it's really all about whether whatever you're doing is the practice of engineering and geoscience. So we have a definition of what that is, and if the person who is teaching is doing the practice of engineering and geoscience, then they have to be licensed. It's kind of the simplest form of that. Well, so if they're teaching and they're teaching people how to design in engineering or geoscience, then definitely that would be the case. Or if, and with professors and things like that, they do research. And so as part of their research, if they're practicing engineering or geoscience, then they would need to be licensed.
Other questions?
up here, Melanie's.
Thanks, Keith. Super awesome. Really great. I love that you've looked at this so thoroughly, and the whole idea of new practice looking by sector. It's really good. So earlier with all those 38 selections, we were only allowed, I think, 3. Is that right? We were only allowed to check off 3?
Correct.
Yeah. So we can check off more than one in these categories?
Yeah, and I think at some point, there's going to have to be the conversation, not just about the practice area, but also the activities within the area. And I look, for example, right now I'm a member of the MIA as well, the Manitoba Institute. So we look like in crop production, we look at nutrient management plans. There is a very specific roster that MIA has produced. Only people in that roster are allowed to do nutrient management plans.
Right.
And if you think about the situation here in BC with the Halkar aquifer and the fact that the new waste management regulation stipulates that nutrient management plans will be done now. They're going to be compulsory under certain conditions, and they have to be done by a qualified professional.
That's right.
We're probably going to be looking at rosters of some sort within BCIA as well.
Well, sorry, I'll get back to you a sec. Just add a little bit. We actually had this discussion in a council meeting yesterday morning about the 3. Nobody on the current council could remember where it came from. And we sort of didn't table it, but we said that if we can't, and we couldn't yesterday justify why is it 3 and not 4.7 or 1, or like nobody knew. So I get the feeling from the council discussion that is going to change for 22. And that sort of touches on some of the timing issues. Remember the September 1st deadline for reserve practice. However, we work on a calendar year. So the areas of practice that you declared for 22 will remain that until November of 22 when you do your new declaration using these new areas. And prior to that time, council will have a decision on should there be a limit, should there be any limit on the number. The one of the thoughts was it's really a question of competency. If you're competent in 7, you should be allowed to have 7. If you're only competent in 1, then you should only do 1. But because we have found that people sort of, I can go up to 3, okay, I'll pick 3. Maybe they shouldn't. And there's other people who can easily do 5. So we're working on it.
It's also a tool for us as agrologists, right? If someone's looking for an agrologist, we want to be in the right place. We want to have our name in the right place.
Yeah.
But of course, we would only do within our own ability, which is why I want to ask, where is erosion and sediment control, and why isn't bioengineering with that?
Sorry, there's a lot of echo here. So
What would you put erosion and sediment control under? And why wouldn't you include bioengineering with that? Because if a person's designing something, like you say, you have an agrologist hat, an engineering hat, we bring in an engineer because we know how our limits. And if there's property or public infrastructure at risk, for sure you'd bring them in. But if it's redesigning a creek, you'd totally bioengineer as an agrologist. I think that's what I think.
yeah, I think what you're hinting at there, and I had reviewed all the Alberta Institute practice standards, and most of them are fairly clear cut. But then you go look at the wetlands and riparian areas one, okay? And you see there where basically everybody's in there. Biologists, agrologists, engineers, and just about every government agency. I think Ducks Unlimited, there are going to be some of these practice areas where we're going to have to sit down with our friends in the engineering profession, biology profession, and there's going to be that intersection. We're going to have to figure out what's the piece that agrologists in particular are good at versus the engineers and some of the other sectors, and what are some of the pieces where there might actually be true overlap, right? There's a lot of work to be done here yet. Hey, George, shoot.
I was just kind of initially, when I was thinking about it, this whole area of, the human, you mentioned human resources being set back, but I
Yeah.
was thinking about the rural sociology, looking at the economics again, farm transition and succession is not really like an extension activity or education. It's still, but in many cases, it's integrated in with that rural sociology, rural economics. And again, it's just like the previous question is, those are subsets of maybe of the broader thing. And maybe we need to think about what's included within maybe that broader area of practice. I don't know.
Yeah.
Still trying to get my head around it. So.
Yeah.
Question.
Over in,
We have, sorry, I forgot to mention in the beginning, we do have many people online and the questions are coming in. Can't make, okay. No, I can get to it. Great work, Keith. Two thoughts for consideration. One, relying on the member practice area classifications for determining the number of registrants with a specific expertise may be misleading since members are presently only allowed to identify 3 practice areas. We talked about that. Many agrologists likely work and have expertise in other areas. 2, related to the above, bioengineering is largely an environmental reclamation practice, not an engineering practice. Many agrologists, biologists, and environmental technicians provide these services more so than engineers. So in my view, the bioengineering should be identified within the land reclamation practice area. It sounded sort of like the first 2 questions.
oh, okay.
Yeah. No, so we're dealing with the question of the self-declaration of your practice area.
Yeah.
And there will be a new way of doing that for next year. But on this, the bioengineering and in reclamation aspect, because I did notice that it was one of the areas that you used the word retracted in your list of retracted areas of practice. Yeah. What exactly do you mean by retracted first?
I don't think we'll list it in the future. Like I look at the survey responses, okay? And in there I see things like bioengineering. Some people list things like composting and stuff, right? And really we sort of cover that under the bioprocessing part of the processing side, right? The waste management. Some of these practice areas, we might retract them here, but the people are still out there. They're still doing the work. It's just that now they're in a different chair than they were yesterday, or a chair with a slightly different name on it. And it may be that they're grouped a little differently.
Okay.
But they're still there. I mean, there's some responses, we got to the survey, like references to wildlife management or natural ecosystems, but really,
that's not us.
That's not us. That's our friends, the biologists, or other things that might truly be engineering related work.
Other questions? Carl?
Cutting away a fair amount of my work, Keith. And that is practice area 36. And I'll give you what I consider to be a very good example of it. I do a fair number, and I know that some people from the Agricultural Land Commission are here, but I do a fair number of applications to the Agricultural Land Commission on behalf of growers for temporary farm worker housing, for example. So bringing Mexicans and Jamaicans in. I'm not necessarily providing legal advice on it. I'm giving them regulatory support as they move through the Agricultural Land Commission, through the local government regulations, back to the Agricultural Land Commission, ultimately to building permit issuance and otherwise. And for me, that's bread and butter work.
True, but
where do I go in the future? Where do I fit in the future?
But
I know where a lot of people would like me to go, and that's over to the barking parrot and talk to myself. I got that. But
I think the way you think about this, Carl, and forgive me if I'm being prejudiced here, but you're supporting, for example, people who are growing crops, right? I mean, and
yes,
you're pulling on some of that knowledge about how many acres they have and how much manpower it's going to take to grow those crops. So this is an activity under crop production. You're pulling on your core knowledge areas from crop production, not necessarily. I mean, yes, you built on it in terms of support of the regulatory processes for these guys to get their labor or house their labor, et cetera. But you're under crop production in some way, shape, or form.
I'll buy that. I just needed to know where I was supposed to go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I have an issue with the 36 as well. And I know that that is the reason that's getting stricken is because that is an area that applied to everyone. And I think a lot of individuals use that category or area of practice because we do things like waste discharge authorizations. We do other applications for the ministry. They're very specific, and for things like contaminated sites, which fall under the spill response,
Yeah.
hazardous waste. There's a bunch of things that covers. We just want to make sure that under the amalgamated sectors that you've proposed, that there is wording within each that leads itself to some kind of regulatory support. There is concern by a lot of people that the term environmental protection, that's, well, I saw it in your sectors, that's there, but that's how we provide protection to the public. We are there overseeing submissions, different things that just, they are falling through the cracks in our areas of practice. And that was quite a generic category that caught a lot of things and gave us all a lot of confidence, I think, in all the areas that we've been working in.
Yeah.
So I think you'll see some pushback on that.
Okay. Appreciate the comment.
I wanted to reply to that a little bit, because one of the things I got from Paul's presentation this morning is that we have an area this big that is agrology, the practice of agrology, and we have this area here, which is reserved. I agree that with Keith, to be honest, that the area that we're known for is part of this area. We may or may not have a reserved portion. For instance, anybody else could be taking stuff to the Land Commission too, other than the fact that the Land Commission won't talk to them. But yeah, but it's you know, it can be a biologist that takes to the Land Commission as well, and talks about the regulations. So I see that as, it could be a person without any. Yep.
Yeah.
But and whether or not it fits within our areas of practice and our reserved areas of practice is really going to be up to JP to take a look at, and then if he sends it off, he's going to go to the chair of the investigative committee. Well, that'd be me. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. So and the other thing was, is the question was asked, and Rob said, where did that 3 come from? And I said it came right out of the air. Back when we set up, it was I think, Keith, you said there was 500 or 900. It was 900. I think it was closer to 3, but then who's arguing? So, but
Hundreds.
Yeah, it was hundreds. And when we came down to 38, somebody said, well, how many should we allow? And we just said, oh, well, 3 sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Just as an agricultural economist, I would find that my category, has really shrunk based upon what I currently do. So with the definitions that are there, I'm basically working outside of my area of competence. Some of the areas I look at is that I deal a lot in the area of understanding farming systems and applying economics. And yet I'm not a production expert. I'm not a crop expert. I don't fall into those areas. However, without my underlying knowledge of farming systems, I wouldn't be able to do the economic analyses that I do. Secondly, I give a lot of expert opinions that are used in courts of law and in various other areas. I give expert opinions on the feasibility of farm plans, not at the growing of the product
or the marketing of it, but of the feasibility of those farm plans. That would kind of leave me out of that picture there as well. I do a lot of work in agricultural impact assessment. I don't see agricultural impact assessment mentioned anywhere. So I would see that as being a gap. Okay, that'll be good for now. Thank you.
Those comments are very much appreciated, Daryl. And it wasn't my intention to push you off to the side. Some of the wording and part of the reason why we're doing what we're doing today and that report's up there is so that, yeah, you can provide that feedback and input.
I would sort of think there needs to be an umbrella category too. I mean, we're creating silos again, whereas really it's an interdisciplinary approach to agriculture that's going to work. So there should be some way of, I don't know what it is, an umbrella category, or I noticed in one of the categories there, you did mention agricultural and resource economics as being a knowledge area outside of the economics area, but you don't have the same consideration for agriculture, for economics, sorry.
Thank you. Just to follow up on what Rebecca and Carl were talking about earlier, I think it's important for us to know that if an agrologist would put his or her signature on a document, those people would have been fully aware of what regulatory context applies, and all of their assertions, recommendations, and conclusions are drawn within the regulatory context that applies.
Mm-hmm.
That's different from saying, hey, this is feasible, this is economically and technically feasible, I recommend you do this. Well, that recommendation must be made within the regulatory context. So we need to know that an agrologist saying, I recommend you do this, is fully aware, cognizant of the regulatory context and what applies and what can and cannot be done, so that, a regulatory body then can rely on that recommendation.
Yeah, I agree. Each of these, even though I may not have caught it in this draft, each of these practice areas should be contingent on the agrologist understanding the regulatory framework under which they operate. Yeah.
See, I think, Keith, where some of the concern and confusion is coming from is, your wording of retraction of number 36. And maybe in our final draft of this, a little bit more clarification might help, because you're not by saying that on the screen, you're not saying that the agrologists don't have to know about regulation.
That's right.
Okay, because that it sort of suggests when you look at that might be what you're saying.
And he can choose that. We want to be able to declare that I have a CV that is strictly for that. I get hired because that's my background. I have a strong understanding of the applications that I'm doing. And when I declare to the ministry for those applications, that's what I'm declaring on. That I'm not saying that I am an expert for the design aspect or whatnot, but I know what was needed for that. I will stand by this. And when things go sideways, I am the one that's solely responsible. And I understand that. And it varies because this is such a diverse group of individuals.
Yep.
It's like I said before, it's a catch-all, but just apply it. And I would actually expand upon it. I wouldn't just say regulatory support. I would say public engagement and consultation. There's more things that go on now in that group.
Not to drag on the subject, but also there's two things is you run the risk of people thinking that it's no longer a regulated activity of the regulatory support. Because a lot of the legislation will say you need the professional to do those,
Yeah.
those applications. But the other thing is, oh no, I just tied it in. Yeah, it's like it specifies QEP, but you don't want to run the risk of people like unregulating people and sending them off.
Correct.
So, yeah.
And then we've also got the problem that was kind of alluded to this morning is what happens when you end up with, you know, in the questions to Paul Craven, an agrologist that's doing work within government that really they don't have the background to do it, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's, yeah.
And I had a question, I kind of alluded to it when I talked to you yesterday, but part of the survey, there were the questions at the end where do you overlap with other regulators for this position? If so, who? Did any of those get answered? No.
Oh, no, there's people that did identify that there was in almost all the different practice areas from the survey that did identify other professionals that they run into.
But were there any that said, no, only agrologists do this task?
I don't think so.
Okay,
In any way, shape or form.
just curious, but awesome job, Keith.
I mean, there was some, for example, who mentioned, like I remember seeing nutrient management being listed by one or two respondents and saying that they saw biologists doing this. I think that's something we'd have, you know, that we have to question. Why are biologists doing nutrient management plans?
Thanks, Keith, for sharing all of this information. I just wanted to clarify. So these areas of practice that have been identified here is what BCIA is going to define as your reserve practice. Okay, as your regulated practice. Okay, that's great. So I guess, so representing one of the other regulators under the PGA, one of the areas that I see a potential concern is through the listed practice areas that you've identified, you have named, I'll say, specific things that other regulators are. So as an example, agroforestry, forestry, and silviculture squarely lands in the forestry professionals group. And so I think there needs to be clarity with all the regulators as to what parts does the agrologist play and what parts do, in this case, the foresters play. It's the same with the bioengineering in there. I mean, it says engineering, so you automatically assume that it's going to be regulated in the engineering profession. And it doesn't mean that no one else can work in there, but we need to understand what that is. And so I just throw caution to all of this because there are a lot of statements that have been identified that are in someone else's regulated practice. And so I think more dialogue at the regulatory table, more dialogue amongst practitioners needs to happen so we're clear. Oh, no, I was just trying to get.
Oh, okay. Up here, okay. Can you make the font bigger, say it, so I can read it? Yeah, you can't, okay. Okay. Where are we starting? Okay, for those that don't know, Bonnie Kelleher would have been here today, but she is under the weather. She has worked quite closely with Keith on this project. Bonnie was with us for several years. She retired, and I don't know, 3 weeks later, we hired her back on a contract or something, and she's still there, thankfully. So she says, under your professional practice, under your professional or PD declaration, you will identify whether you do education or research or regulatory support under your declared PA. Keith, what is she talking about there?
Sorry.
Do you understand?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so when you do your PD entry to declare your areas of practice, you will declare whether you do education, research, or regulatory support in that area. I'm guessing there will be a tick box Bonnie's also very key in doing the development of our new website. So she has some back end ideas that we haven't all quite heard yet. So that may be the fix to not being able to declare those as your main areas of practice.
Then she also says for agroforestry, the definition in the, oh, yeah, if you mostly do regulatory support, that would be declared under your annual professional development declaration under your professional practice. And then there is another comment here for agroforestry. The definition is the integration of growing trees with crops and or livestock. For the knowledge piece in the presentation, I saw soils, but not livestock and crops. Is this a gap? Keith? So it goes a bit to Heidi's point. I mean, here's an example. Absolutely, there has to be a clarification of who does what. But we have to have something to tie it to begin with. Okay, other questions?
Right behind you,
Oh.
Russ.
Thanks, Keith. That's a mammoth job you've done. And just three generalized comments that I can follow up with later. With regards to rangeland management, rangeland ecology and management, having done a PhD in that area and aware of what's happening internationally, a key premise in rangeland management is the notion of carrying capacity. Again, and the notion of carrying capacity in terms of defoliation. And defoliation can occur by livestock, wildlife, fire. And so there's a real need to have that fully integrated picture. And there's a clear overlap with our wildlife biology colleagues there, but not to exclude those areas because it's fundamental to that discipline. I guess the other caution I have is in terms of some of the stuff I've been following is that climate change is, in terms of going forward, maybe it covers all the areas, but I believe, and I have immense respect for Dave Spittlehouse and aware of some of his work, but there's this whole area of extending that information in terms of delivering it out. And I think there's not an area of agrology that isn't going to be or is already being impacted by climate change. And I just think we need to make sure we don't drop that one because it's, looking forward 10 years, 30 years, it's going to be hugely important if the current trends carry on. And then I guess the other thing that I've struggled a little bit, which I think some of our economists have alluded to, but it's just where's the interface with the whole kind of area of rural sociology. And just like we saw that in the presentation before lunch this morning. And I know when I was working as a young scientist for Ag Canada, they were beginning to introduce that with proposals, like on the science side of things, you had to include the sociological side of things. And so I think the whole systems approach, like, is there a role for the generalist, a generalist agrologist? I don't know. I'm just throwing that idea out there, but you think of a general practice physician, but the folk who do extension education and all those kinds of things, they need that science, but they need to know when to refer to someone who's more of a specialist. But I think in terms of moving the science to the decision makers on the ground, this is a hugely important area too that we need to think about. And I think the systems approach, the farming systems and extension kind of approach is a really integral part of agrology. It may not be that hard science side, but it's the application of the hard science to moving the information to the decision makers. Thanks, but thank you. This is good stuff.
I tried. I may have missed a few holes here and there, but.
Anybody else? Okay. Oh, Warren. I knew you couldn't resist.
Great job, Keith.
Thank you.
Now, I just think, just to nail down the regulatory support, and we were just having a little side discussion here. There is a lot of, it's not that they're going to take it out, but there's a whole bunch of things that we need to be thinking of as agrologists when we do we act within these practice areas, Indigenous considerations, climate change considerations, regulatory support, and public engagement. These are just parts that we need to be considering throughout the whole thing. So it's not that they're being taken out, they're just being spread across everything. And then bringing up the discussion of overlapping areas of practice with other regulators. It's not just a time of identifying these. It's going to take unprecedented collaboration, not just to identify them, but also to manage and ensure that competency standards and everything's kept up to date. And that's going to take cooperation across regulators forever.
Okay, with that, I'd just like to thank Keith for all the work. It's amazing. We will certainly take these comments to heart, and especially the online thing. And I know OSPG was attending online as well, so I'd be shocked if I didn't get an email on Monday morning. But it is something, a very good base to start with, and we're going to move forward to finalize that and simultaneously work on the descriptive materials we talked about earlier today. So that's it for the day. Please note that you now have exclusive access to the Barking Parrot until 8 o'clock. Food is there at 6:30. There is light entertainment about 6 o'clock, and then the headliner goes on at 8 o'clock. Please drop by. We have some really good door prizes. We have food. I hear there's alcohol there. Yes, because we're so short of it. Okay, thank you very much for a great day. We'll see you tonight and tomorrow as well.